Hello and welcome again to the Writer Review. This is Eric Carruth, writer, and this week we're going to be taking a look back at the 1996 movie called The Juror. Now, The Juror is based on a novel by George Dawes Green, and it was directed by Brian Gibson. The genre of the film is a romantic thriller, and it was produced by Irwin Winkler, and the music was done by James Newton Howard. The cinematography is James Anderson, and the editing is by Robert Retano. And the stars of the movie are Demi Moore, Alec Baldwin, a very young Joseph Gordon-Levitt, Tony LaBianco, Michael Rispoli, Anne Heche, and James Gandolfini. Now, the story of the movie goes a little something like this. Demi Moore plays the role of Annie Laird, who is a sculptor, and she is also a clerk. So she kind of balances two jobs. She lives in New York City with her son Oliver, played by a very young Joseph Gordon-Levitt, and she was chosen to be a juror in the court to the trial of a mob kingpin named Louis Buffano, played by Tony LaBianco, in the murder of Salvatore Riggio. Alec Baldwin plays the role of Vincent the teacher, who, after praising and purchasing Annie's artwork, he gives her an ultimatum that if she doesn't acquit Buffano, she and her son will die. Annie persuades the jury to acquit Buffano, but it's not likely that you'll see the end of Buffano, the teacher, and the rest of the other gang of goons. The teacher eventually ends up having intercourse with Annie's friend, who's a doctor. Her name is Juliet, played by Anne Heche. And then eventually he ends up pulling a trigger on her as he threatens her to overdose herself with drugs. Fearing for her son's safety, she sends Oliver to hide out as far away as Guatemala with a care from a bohemian type artist by the name of Boone, played by Matt Craven. And Annie is warned eventually by the prosecutor, who reports that the teacher wants to become the main kingpin, the mob kingpin, and in order for him to do that, he must take over the Buffano Empire. So Annie persuades the prosecutor to wear kind of like a wire around her, and she eventually meets with the teacher. The teacher, who's unaware that Annie is wearing a wire, leaks out his ambitions, which is recorded on tape. Annie tips off Buffano, and Buffano eventually has a meeting with his henchmen, but that plan eventually backfires as the teacher kills both Buffano and his son Joseph, played by Michael Rispoli. The teacher angrily goes over to Guatemala to do what he wanted to do all this time: kill her son. The teacher sends Oliver on a chase where locals shoot the mobster. Annie, who also, for the protection of her son, also goes off to Guatemala. And while the locals shoot the teacher, Annie decides to fire a few times to make sure the bastard's dead. In fact, he almost shot Annie with a spare gun that he got from his ankle holster. And eventually it ends with Annie and Oliver are no longer under threat from the mafia, and I guess everything just kind of all wraps up from there. Now here's my opinion about the movie. Over the years, watching movies, there are two types of movies that kind of stand out above all. The ones that are beyond excellent, and those that are complete garbage. And then there are the ones that teeter between not entirely bad and not really all that good either. And they kind of are the ones that become forgotten, sort of like left out like a sore thumb. Brian Gibson's The Juror, based on the novel by George Dawes Green, falls into that category of forgettable average films, even though it casts a very strong bevy of talented performers like Demi Moore, Alec Baldwin, Joseph Gordon-Levitt, James Gandolfini, and Heche. It's a very easy film to keeping its obscure status because it's overall a mediocre film that actually leads towards a bad mediocre rather than a good mediocre. And it has some rather absurd characters complemented with an even more absurd story that goes way off kilter at times. And I think it's a little bit over the top. I mean, Demi Moore has been assigned to stand as a juror on the trial of a hardened mafia criminal mob boss, only to tell her that her life and her young son Oliver are in jeopardy if they don't acquit this man who is blatantly guilty for the murder of Salvatore Riggio, a minion of his known only as the teacher. All he wanted her to do was plead not guilty. She does that, but they still continue to harass and endanger her life and her son's life even after the trial has been done, even after Louis Buffano has been acquitted. So even after the trial folds, her and her son's life are still in the balance, which leads to her taking care of business herself personally. I guess, it goes to show you that if all else fails, bottoms up. Okay, now I'm going to tell you there is a pro to this movie. I know that the cons outweigh the pros here, but the big pro here is that the intensity level of the story is really not that bad, considering that a juror was forced to overrule a decision by a mafia minion. And the suspense even after the trial, with her still being under the threat, has the makings of what could have been a very engaging, exciting thriller. And this was like something I haven't seen in quite a long time. I mean, this is what you would probably expect in a bone-chilling suspense thriller. But the script by Ted Talley, who wrote such a remarkable script for Silence of the Lambs, this movie was badly executed, making the story awfully surreal. The characters just don't match nicely to the storyline and charge up the tense dramatic scenes. In fact, it goes way out of proportions to the point where it unintentionally becomes more laughable then spine-chilling. Even the opening scenes where Annie has a chance to bow out of the trial is very awkwardly built up. I personally would never consider stepping up to such a situation knowing that your loved one or your own personal life would be in jeopardy. It just seems odd that Annie seems more determined to go through with it, which makes her at times a bit of a daft individual. I mean, why does she want to risk her life and her son's life just knowing the reputation these people are? So her enthusiasm, therefore, doesn't give much sympathy to her situation, as she gladly agrees to the trial, and that a mob henchman is breathing down her and her son's neck unless he pleads not guilty to the judge. And to make matters worse, after the trial, she decides to just arbitrarily take matters into her own hands. I mean, she goes from being this fearful, protective mother, protective of her life, and then all of a sudden she just rapidly becomes kind of a Dirty Harriet type character, as she decides that you want some, come and get some type persona. And this doesn't give much to yearn for her sympathy. We want to root for her all the way, yes. But she makes it virtually impossible because she keeps making one stupid decision after another. I mean, what the fuck is wrong with you? The surrealist structuring isn't with just the protagonists, but also the antagonists also fall under that spell too. I mean, Alec Baldwin's character, Mark the teacher Cordell, is meant to be chilling. He's supposed to be a cold-blooded, remorseless killer, but he just doesn't come across that cerebral. I mean, granted, Baldwin does do a good job of making this man, you know, a cool, collected individual, but it seems his motives are not fully functioning at times. Now, listen, I know that Demi Moore won a Razzie Award for Worst Actress in her category, and I don't think she needs to go that far, because I didn't think her performance was that bad. Neither Alec Baldwin. They do give out what's given to them, but the motives between the leading hero and the leading villain just don't seem to mesh in quite well with the genre of the movie. Surely, to even have a compelling ending, you have to mold the ending with some rather bizarre twists that are not necessarily plausible. But at least it should come to some kind of effective conclusion, which in this movie fails quite miserably. And in the genre of suspenseful thrillers, it should come as a no surprise. Sadly, the results are not thrilling. In fact, it's just plain dumb and quite unconvincing. And by the way, how did the teacher know that Oliver was hiding in Guatemala? And what's there in Guatemala that Oliver needs to hide out? Is there a relative? Is there anybody there in particular? It's not very convincing that Oliver has to hide out as far off as Guatemala. What's up with that? If it would have had a conclusion similar to like that of Runaway Jury, then I guess this movie would have had a much better outcome. If they had gone with Annie overturning the judge's decision, then I wouldn't be ranting too much on this movie. And also the supporting cast behind Moore and Baldwin also failed to add any impression on me. Joseph Gordon-Levitt, who I guess as we speak today, has gone on to bigger, greater things. Well, he was actually quite convincing as an innocent child put in a precarious situation by his naive mother. Comes across as probably maybe the only closest I could have to a sympathetic character. James Gandolfini, God rest his soul, I still miss you to this day, who would later of course become the iconic Tony Soprano, was near perfect as fellow mob henchman Eddie. And, when he got his throat slashed by the teacher, that was probably like the only chilling moment in this movie. But he wasn't really offered much to do here. And Anne Heche's Juliet, she comes across as just a cliched sex symbol who gets a little jazzy with the teacher. It's not like as if that kind of role has never been done before. It's been done millions of times, regardless of what genre you're watching. At long last, all I could say is that The Juror was an unsatisfying thriller that was let down by the characters and a story structure that loses its direction and tarnishes in what could have potentially been a very exciting thriller. The efforts to boost excitement was put off because they took a wrong turn in many directions, making this movie contrived and stupid instead of what could have potentially been a chilling, suspenseful film, which this film had potential to be really good, but it unfortunately failed quite miserably. If I was to give this a scale out of 1 to 10, it's only a 5 for me, and maybe I might even be that generous. But like I said, Moore and Baldwin's performances were pretty good. The setup to have this movie had potential to be, a bone-chilling thriller. But, the script, the direction, and the characters really let me down on this. So I would not really recommend people to see this movie unless you want to see it for a one-time deal, just to be curious. Just to be curious about it. Curious about it. And I guess that wraps up my writer review. Thank you very much for listening. Please write in. I would truly appreciate it. Be kind, be curious, and refrain from using any kind of verbal abuse. Okay? I will be back again with another review. Until next time, take care of yourselves, everyone. Goodbye.